It's been a while, but we're back. The Josh Hendrickson Show here on MPW Digital. I'm Neal McCready. That is Josh Hendrickson, Chair of Economics at the University of Mississippi, otherwise known as Ole Miss. Not Mississippi State, not Ole Miss University, just University of Mississippi or Ole Miss. Josh, welcome back. It's been a month. I just looked it up. A little over a month since we last podcasted.
Yeah, Liberation Week.
All right. I mean, you're not even going to small talk it. I'm going to get right to it. I had my mailbag today up at rebelgrove.com, part of the Rivals Network. Question 1 was about tariffs. Question 17, which was also the final question, was about tariffs. I answered both with, hey, we're taping with Josh at 3:30. I just didn't. Number one, I don't think my opinion matters at all. I'm just a sap working as a sports, whatever this is called. And yet everyone's got an opinion. There's a lot of experts out there these days on tariffs. You are an economics guy. I just pulled up the Wall Street Journal. Big headline: stock surge, furious rally as Trump pauses some tariffs. Subhead: China tariff increases to 125%. Dow soars 2,900 points. NASDAQ jumps 12% on 90-day reprieve. Just yesterday, the world was ending. Everything was collapsing. Get your money out. It's been a while. Trump talked tariffs on the campaign trail. I don't know that he talked tariffs to this extent on the campaign trail. What's going on? I'm going to hand you the floor. I'm going to play the role of village idiot. And when you start getting wonky, if you do, I will say, wait a minute, I'm confused. What's going on? Should people be concerned? Where's this going? What's the end game? Go.
Well, I think we actually need to start by setting the stage for what's happening.
Okay.
And so first of all, I think that there are 3 broad trends that are kind of behind everything that the Trump administration is thinking about. And the reason I bring these up is that anytime you do anything, the question in economics is about the counterfactual. And the problem is we don't ever observe the counterfactual, right? So in other words, a sports example is you think about the Super Bowl where Pete Carroll decided to throw a pass instead of handing it to Marshawn Lynch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So everybody says that's a really stupid play, but they say it's a stupid play because it didn't work. And so you've got this great running back and you threw the ball and, if you would have just handed it to your running back, he would have scored. Well, the presumption is that he would have scored, right? The counterfactual that they're going with is had you handed the ball off, you would have scored a touchdown. Instead, You threw an interception and you lost. We don't actually know what the counterfactual is, though, right? And that's what makes economics difficult because we have to think about the relevant counterfactual. And I think the problem with a lot of the commentary on what's going on is that people don't understand what the relevant counterfactual is, right? So they're looking at the things that the Trump administration is doing, and then they're comparing that to this hypothetical world where we just continue what we were doing and everything works out.
Right.
And that's not the relevant counterfactual. And so because that's not the relevant
meaning it's not the relevant counterfactual because you don't know that it would have worked out.
No, because if he wasn't doing these things, the status quo is not going to work out.
Okay.
There are these trends that are pushing us away from sort of the benefits of the status quo. And so to just look at things and say, hey, look, things look like they're going pretty good. Let's just keep doing the things that we're doing now. That's not the relevant counterfactual, because if we keep doing what we're doing now, there are a lot of things that are actually going to get worse. Okay. Even if we do nothing. So the question is what they are doing going to make things better than if we did nothing? And knowing that if we do nothing, things will actually get worse. Okay. So there's 3 broad trends here. Okay. One is we've had this essentially 100-year period of the creeping importance of the administrative state. Okay. This started back with people like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and things like that, which was like, let's put the experts in charge. Let's create these agencies in the federal government. We'll staff them with experts. They can make decisions. Like, we'll trust them to do what's right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that that essentially leads to rule by experts who are totally unaccountable to everybody else. Okay, so one trend is that this idea that we're just going to put the experts in charge and that will improve policy, that hasn't borne out, because what's happened over time is that, first of all, people don't seem to understand how narrow their expertise is, right? So they talk about things without considering the broader implications. Like, the prime example of this is like during COVID, you would talk to like an epidemiologist and they would basically just say like, everybody just needs to stay home because then they won't get sick. From an epidemiological perspective, like, that's true. Like, if everybody just stayed home, like, then they wouldn't get sick, right? But the point is that there's a cost associated with staying home. So then what you need is you actually need to talk to economists about like what the economic cost of that is. You need to talk to, psychologists and social workers about like what's the impact on other people, right? And so the problem is we have this system where the administrative state is now basically like this fourth branch of government. And they're this fourth branch of government that's completely unaccountable, because when Trump shows up and he says, hey, we're going to fire these people, then you have all these judges come in and say,
just scoot that way just a little bit.
That
there you go. Perfect.
That you can't that he can't do it. Well, if he can't do it, then these people are just unaccountable, but they're also part of the government, so they're like they're an unaccountable fourth branch. So that's trend number one that we have to think about, right? Is that this is making lots and lots of things worse. And we'll circle back to like the types of things and how this is related to trade. Okay. The second thing that people have to realize is that for most of us, our only experience with the world is post-World War II. And so we are used to like this, what I would call like the Cold War consensus, right? And that is that like the relations between countries in the world after World War II were entirely dependent on economic factors, right? Your two major superpowers, you had the United States and you had the Soviet Union.
Yep.
Okay. Capitalists and communists.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Rocky and Ivan Drago.
Everybody's alliances were lined up. You either lined up with the United States or you lined up with the Soviet Union, which also meant that you either lined up with capitalism or you lined up with communism.
Right.
And so what that meant is that foreign policy was primarily about economics. The thing that I don't think people understand is that that's unique to this post-World War II world. The idea that foreign policy is really really just about economics, that is something that is unique to the Cold War. Typically, what determined like foreign policy and like alliances and international relations were sort of like shared culture, shared values, historical alliances, these kinds of things, right? And so one of the things that we've seen is, since the Cold War ended, what we've seen is we've actually seen us moving back towards like the historical relationships between countries. I mean, one of the obvious examples was like one of the first major conflicts after the end of the Cold War was like the Civil War in Yugoslavia. And what you saw there is you saw ethnic divisions.
Right.
So everything was ethnic, and it was on like ethnic and religious grounds. And what you saw is you saw old alliances start to break apart, where all of a sudden you would have this block of countries that were maybe capitalist countries, but what you saw is like the Christian capitalist countries kind of lined up behind the Christians in the war, like the Muslim capitalist countries kind of lined up behind the Muslims in the war, right? Like these, so you started to see that like the old historical type things were reemerging. And if you look at that, if you look at every single thing that's going on with foreign policy, what you see is you see a return of history, in the sense that like the Cold War alliances that we're used to, the Cold War sort of equilibrium is no longer. That's no longer what the board looks like. Like, and you see this.
Okay.
You see this in Ukraine. Okay. So setting aside, what the United States is doing in Ukraine, like the idea that somehow Russia and Ukraine would go to war is not unbelievable, and it wasn't unpredictable. There were people in the 90s who were saying, hey, it's inevitable that at some point there's going to be a battle over Ukraine. And the reason is that it's a large geographic area, and the western part is they're much more like Europeans, and the eastern part are much more like Russians. Okay. And the Russians have always had kind of an identity crisis, right? They've always kind of been like, well, are we like this unique Russian people, or are we just part of Europe? And so like that bleeds over into Ukraine. And so you see these things like people can't wrap their heads around like, well, why would Russia invade Ukraine? Like, why would they do these things? Now, part of the reason is that some people just put morals on these kinds of things, and they look at through a moral, like, they look through it through the lens of morality, like, well, you shouldn't invade another country and therefore blah, blah, blah. Okay. Like our issue is we got to understand why people do what they do, independent of what's right and wrong. Like we're trying, like, because even if somebody's doing something wrong, you still want to understand why they're doing something that you think is wrong. Right. But so the point is that those kinds of conflicts are exactly the type of conflicts that you used to see in the world. And like the Cold War kind of got rid of those kinds of conflicts because the conflicts were largely over capitalism and communism, aligning with the United States or the Soviet Union. Same thing, like, you see the Middle East, this, Israel Hamas thing, right? Literally, what is that? That's a religious conflict, right? So what you're seeing is you're seeing a return of these old patterns of history.
Okay.
The third thing is that we are now about 50 years into a massive experiment with our international monetary system. So prior to 1971, currencies always had some kind of relation to like gold or silver.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so we went from having actual commodity money where gold and silver coins were the currency to having a world where you had gold and silver coins, but then you also had these pieces of paper, but they were redeemable for those gold or silver coins, right? And this was always the state of affairs in the world. And so after World War II, like the Bretton Woods Agreement kind of tied the dollar to gold and then tied the rest of the world's currencies to the dollar. And so it was sort of like the old system, but like they hoped with more flexibility. Well, it turns out is not enough flexibility for what, the United States and other countries wanted to do. So this thing collapses. But then we have this system that's in place now where we have a world that consists of all of these fiat currencies, right? Like the dollar, like why do you accept a dollar? You accept a dollar because you expect other people to accept dollars, right? Like if you give me a $10 bill, like I'm going to take the $10 bill because I expect somebody else is going to accept the $10 bill, not because the $10 bill has any actual like value. It's not like I can take it to the bank and get a gold or silver coin for it, right? Like,
right.
And so the thing is that we're in this world, and not only are we in this world, but we have like this unique aspect of this world, which is it's not just that we have all these fiat currencies. It's that what has replaced gold as the primary reserve asset of the world is U.S. government debt.
Oh, okay.
So people hold these. So foreign central banks, instead of holding, gold in reserve, well, I mean, they still hold some gold, but instead of like that being the primary thing that they hold, what they hold are treasury bonds. And so they're sitting on U.S. government debt. That's their reserve. Okay. And this creates a problem. And it creates a problem not only with regards to government debt, but it creates a problem with respect to trade. Okay. So one of the problems that it creates with respect to trade is that, I keep hearing people when they talk about tariffs, they say, well, the textbook says, blah, 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 right? Okay, you know what the textbook also says? The textbook also says that if you run a trade deficit in a sort of world of fiat currencies, if you run a persistent trade deficit, what's going to happen is that your currency is going to start to depreciate because there's too much of your currency flowing abroad. The value is going to fall. If there's an excess supply of your currency, the value is going to fall. And as the value falls, foreign goods are going to become more expensive, and that will naturally close your trade deficit. And so there's a market correcting force that will not allow you to run trade deficits for years and years and years and years. The issue is that the United States has been running a trade deficit for about 40 years. Okay.
One that grows larger and larger by the year, right?
And yes, and the dollar does not depreciate when we run trade deficits. In fact, there are many periods when the dollar appreciates. So it gets more valuable, which makes the trade deficits larger. Okay. And so the thing is that you have to recognize these trends. You have to recognize these trends because all of these trends matter for all of these things that we're talking about. Okay. So first of all, if you go back to the experts, okay, you go back to this world of experts where we've got this team of experts. They're determining they're determining how to enforce policy. They're determining the rules and regulations and things like that. These experts have created a regulatory regime that is incredibly costly. It's very, very hard to make anything in the United States. It takes you a long time to build things. It takes you a long time to make things. You have to comply with all these environmental regulations, with all these labor regulations, with all of these kinds of things. Those kinds of things make us less competitive in the world. Okay. Mm-hmm. And as the administrative state has grown, so have the rules and regulations that they create and enforce. And this is adding to the cost of our production. That is making us uncompetitive. It's also like just ruining like the quality of things. Like, you hear people say this all the time, but it's actually, but it's actually true is like people will complain that like, hey, like, my grandma's washer and dryer, lasted 50 years and like my washer and dryer like lasted 10 years or something like that, right? A lot of this, or that like, hey, I've got this dryer and my dryer doesn't dry my clothes properly, right? Like my old dryer never had a problem. The new dryer I do. Well, these are all as a result.
You've been hanging out in my house.
Yes. These are the result of the regulations that they put in place because they put regulations on like how much power like the motor in your dryer can use. And because they want us to conserve energy. Now, what they don't realize is like, okay, in theory, you're conserving energy, but if I got to run the dryer 2 times instead of 1 time, then like we didn't actually save any energy there. But anyways, so you've got all these regulations that are making us less competitive. It's hard to build things. It's hard to make things. Mm-hmm. It's hard to stay competitive. Okay, so that's one aspect of this. The second aspect of this is that these geopolitical changes. The response to these geopolitical changes has been evident since the mid-90s. But the policy of the United States, essentially since the mid-90s, has been to basically ignore these trends. Like the policy of the United States is basically to pretend that we're still in the Cold War, except that we won and like now Russia's substantially weaker. And so we are the ones that sort of dominate everything, but the world is basically the same. But the world isn't the same. And you're starting to see this as you see how other countries are behaving, both with regards to how they treat one another, but also how they treat the United States. Okay, so that's another issue that we have to think about.
Okay.
And then to come back to the international monetary system, the international monetary system creates a problem, which is that because the dollar is the global reserve currency, what that means is that we don't ever have to think about things like how we pay for trade. We don't ever have to think about that, right? Like because we are the producer of dollars in the United States, so we always have dollars that we can use to buy whatever things that we need abroad. If you are a foreign country, the only way that you can acquire dollars is through trade. Is you run a trade surplus with the United States. You run a trade surplus with the United States, that brings a net inflow of dollars into your country that you can then use to trade with other countries. So you have to run a trade surplus with the United States so that you can then buy things from so you can buy oil from Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
Okay. So the problem that creates is if the trade deficit is not big enough, right? So if it doesn't create a big enough flow of dollars going overseas, that means that there's an excess demand for dollars. When there's an excess demand for anything, the value of that thing goes up, right?
Right.
So the value of the dollar goes up. The value of the dollar goes up, and people, the prominent complainers, the panicans, as Donald Trump would call them, they look at this and they say, well, this is actually good because as the dollar appreciates, all these foreign goods get cheaper. And so that just makes us richer because now we can buy even more stuff, right, than we could before because the dollar is worth more. Of course, that's true on the consumption side. But if you think about it on the production side, it's not just consumption goods that get cheaper. It's also labor. It's also, land. It's also all these things in foreign countries. So, for example, if I own a factory in the United States, if the dollar appreciates significantly, I'm willing to pay a large cost to actually pick up that factory and move it to some other country because my dollar goes farther there. And so,
okay.
So I'm selling. Yeah. So I'm selling things for dollars.
Let's play that out. Let's play out you own a factory in Michigan.
Right.
The dollar appreciates. It's easier to produce your widgets in Vietnam.
Right. Because the dollar, so not only is Vietnamese labor cheaper, but the strength of the dollar makes it even more, it makes it even cheaper. Right. So at a certain point, it becomes sufficiently cheap that you say, actually, we just need to move this factory over there.
Right.
Okay. Now, in terms of international coordination, this kind of solves the problem that there aren't enough dollars flowing overseas, because now in order to buy those goods, you got to ship dollars overseas to like import those goods that you used to make in the United States. Right.
But now the people who were working for you in Michigan are out of work.
Correct. So the thing is like this helps the dollar to stop appreciating. Okay. But it comes at the cost of like offshoring these factories and the jobs. Right.
Right.
Okay. So problem number one is that this system, if you're not running big enough trade deficits, is going to lead to manufacturing and other types of production going overseas because the dollar is too strong. And the dollar is too strong just because we're in this system, which is just part of this experiment that we've been doing since 1971, where the dollar has taken the role of like gold or silver or whatever people, used in the past. So, but then there's also this other aspect of this, which is that foreign central banks, when those dollars go into those foreign countries, the people in those foreign countries don't want dollars, or they might not even be allowed to use dollars. And so what happens is but to some extent they need their own domestic currency. So what do? They take the dollars to the bank and they trade it for their own currency so that they can go about their daily lives.
Okay.
So then that money ultimately ends up flowing into the central bank of that country. And so the central bank has these dollars. They don't want to sit on dollars. So what they do is they take those dollars and they buy U.S. treasuries.
Debt.
Right. Because that's their reserve asset. Like they don't want to sit on dollars, but they'll buy treasuries because treasuries pay a rate of return, whereas dollars don't. Right. And so they take those dollars, they buy treasuries. Well, here's the problem. As the rest of the world...
You say that because the I'm being village idiot. In this case, I'm truly asking. Hey, is that you? Yeah. Would you mind going down and getting us a couple of waters? Yeah, sure. Thank you. Just two water bottles out of the outside fridge. Yeah, sure. Thanks, buddy. It's live production. See, I exported water delivery services to Finland, and here we are. He's a great kid. So the debt collects interest, compounding interest,
right?
Which, as opposed to the dollar, which would just sit,
right,
static,
right. And so they're buying these bonds, but then here's the issue. Okay, so these countries are growing. As they're growing, that means that they're producing more stuff, right? So which means that they have more wealth. As they have more wealth, what's going to happen is that they're going to have a higher demand for dollars. So as they have a higher demand for dollars, their central bank is also going to have a higher demand for U.S. Treasury bonds.
Thank you, Eka.
Thanks. And so,
appreciate you.
If the and so the thing is as those countries grow, their demand for U.S. government debt is growing. And they're price insensitive, right? Because they have to buy these bonds. This is the safest thing that they can put their dollars in is these U.S. Treasury bonds.
Okay.
So they have to buy these bonds. And so they're not paying attention to what the bonds cost. They're not paying attention to what the yield on the bonds are. They're just buying the bonds. We're going to buy these bonds no matter what. So they're buying the bonds. So they're a passive buyer, which means that they are not responsive to whether the United States government is producing too much or too little debt. Like they're not really paying attention to that so much, right? Like they're buying these things anyway. So what this means is that if the United States, so now if we think about the United States and their budget deficits, if you're running a balanced budget, you're not producing any additional debt, right? But the rest of the world would want to hold your debt. Okay, so they're growing. Their demand for your debt is growing. You're not producing any more debt because you're running a balanced budget. Well, what's going to happen is that's going to push yields down on existing government bonds. So in other words, interest rates fall. Politicians look at this and go, interest rates are really low. We should borrow money. We could pave that road. We could build that school. We could, give money for trans comic books in Chile. And so they borrow the money. And so when they do this, like what's happening is because their demand for debt is growing and because it's price insensitive, if the United States does not generate enough new debt, right? If they're not running large enough budget deficits, interest rates in the United States start to get pushed down. But that encourages politicians in the United States to say, look how cheap borrowing is, we'll borrow more, right? And so, in other words,
let's get some more pork going.
Yeah. And so, in other words, now you start to see the total picture. The total picture is we've got this regulatory regime that is ruining our competitiveness. We cannot compete internationally because we have all of these ridiculous rules that prevent us from doing anything. Okay? So we have that. Okay? Then we have all these changing geopolitical circumstances that our ruling class has been ignoring for, the past 10 to 20 years.
Okay.
And then on top of that, then we have this international monetary system that is causing U.S. government debt to essentially grow without limit, right? And that is causing manufacturing jobs to be exported overseas. And so there are lots of people who look at this and go, let's just stick with the status quo. Now, I don't know how, based on what I just described, that you could think that the status quo is even on the table. Because everything that I've just described are trends that are working against the United States in very particular ways.
Right.
And so because it's working against the United States in very particular ways, if you are a policymaker, if you are a politician, you should be looking at these things and thinking, how do we fix this?
Enter Donald Trump, who says, hey, I've been in office 3 months. I told you we were going to change the way we do business, and here we go. And I'm before you dive into what he's doing, I do wonder if what really drives people crazy, especially the people who just are disinclined to like him or highly inclined to hate him, if it's just the fact that this time, unlike the first time, he doesn't seem to give a damn about what people are saying. People were like, he should get off Twitter, and for the most part, he kind of has. And he doesn't have to worry about another election. Now, he does have to worry about his party's election in 2 years. That's going to become an issue. But this time, he seems sort of dead set on, nope, we're going to do this. And he believes, and you can walk me through whether he's right or not, or whether he's partially right, he believes this is the only route to fixing the situation that you just described, and that is to put reciprocal tariffs, right, on the other countries that we deal with, including countries like Canada and Mexico, which in the past have basically been left completely alone.
Well, and if you look at this, it's very clear that what the Trump administration is doing is they're looking at this situation and they're saying we have to figure out a way to correct these trends, right? Like we have to figure out a way to stop what's happening. Now, one of the things that you'll hear Donald Trump talk about, which is important because this actually does get to it does get to an important issue, which is that the United States government provides like a national defense umbrella to our allies. Like when our allies are in trouble, we come to their aid, right?
Right.
And if you look at like Europe is a prime example of this. Like our European allies just expect us to to ride to the rescue when they need us, right? If there's some kind of military conflict. I mean, again, Ukraine is a prime example of this. This is largely an issue for Europe, right? But who's running point on all of this stuff? It's the United States, okay? Because the United States provides the defense umbrella for Europe, okay? But the Europeans then, they sit over in Europe and they lecture us all the time, right? And they lecture us about, how terrible we are and et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Europeans never like U.S. politicians. They're always, and one of the things they lecture us about is they act like they are more enlightened or civilized than we are, right? Like they have big social safety net programs in their country and they lecture us. We protect our poor and we provide healthcare to the poorest people in society and blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's really easy to provide those services like when you don't buy guns or have a military. Right? Like if we cut our entire defense budget, we could sure as hell spend a lot more money on other things. Okay. But the thing is that the United States, as we know it today, would not exist if we were to do those things. Okay. And so they are free riding off of our national defense umbrella. And then, using the fact that they spend substantially less on defense to actually, fund other things, right? So they're saying, oh, well, we don't have to spend all this money on defense. Well, we can have a bigger social safety net, or we can have these other government programs, or we can have, whatever. And essentially what the Trump administration is kind of saying to them is, look, you need to pay for some of this stuff. Okay. You need to pay for the services that we are providing you. Like we are willing to provide these services, but you need to compensate us for them. So in other words, you either need to actually do the amount of military spending that you should be doing if you had to defend yourself, or you should take the money that you would have spent on the military and you should send it to us since we're supplying your military, basically, right? Like we're providing your national defense.
Yeah.
And so when you look at it from that perspective, you see that that's one of the things that, one of the things that the current Treasury Secretary seems to want to do is lengthen the maturity of government debt, right? So one of the things that was happening during the Biden administration, which is one reason why, everybody kept saying, well, the recession is, there's a recession around the corner, and it just never seemed to come. Well, one of the reasons for that is that the Federal Reserve, when they were raising interest rates, they were also pulling all of this short-term government debt out of the system. Well, what that tends to do is that tends to contract the total amount of access to liquidity in the system, and that tends to lead to a recession. But what was going on is Janet Yellen at the Treasury Department, what she was doing is well, we have to borrow money, and so what she was doing is she was issuing all of these 90-day T-bills, right? So she's borrowing at 90 days. Well, we're not paying off that debt in 90 days. So what's happening is actually we're borrowing at 90 days. And then we borrow $100. We owe the person, $3 90 days from now. 90 days come, we pay them the $3. We borrow $100 from somebody else, and we give them that $100. So they get their $103 back, but our debt position isn't changing. All we're doing is we're making interest-only payments on the debt. And we're just rolling it over constantly. And so what she was doing is she's putting, as the Fed is pulling out liquidity, she was putting liquidity back into the system. Okay. And the reason that they were doing this is they didn't want to issue longer term debt, because longer term debt, if you're issuing longer term debt, it tends to drive up interest rates. Well, interest rates were already on the rise and they were afraid it was going to cause a recession. Well, they don't want to cause interest rates to go even higher, because then maybe we'll have a recession. So she's pumping in all this short-term liquidity and essentially offsetting what the Fed is doing, right? So, and so the reason the Fed's aggressive policy didn't lead to a recession is because it was essentially being offset by the Treasury Department. What the new Treasury Secretary wants to do is he says, look, if we're going to have this amount of debt, we cannot be borrowing at 90 days, right? We cannot be borrowing at 1 year, because we're not paying it back in 1 year.
Right.
Okay. So what we have to do is we need to be borrowing longer term, 10 years, 30 years, 100 years. We need to be issuing century bonds, right? And that's his perspective on this. But you can't, but first of all, we can't do that right now because interest rates are still high. But that's what they want to do over the longer term. But part of like what's going on with tariffs and things like that is you're creating a negotiating position so that you can kind of come to these countries and say, listen, you need to start paying for your national defense. One way that you could pay for your national defense is actually just buying the bonds that we're issuing in order to pay for your national defense. Okay. But you're not going to buy 90-day T-bills. What you're going to buy is you're going to buy century bonds. Because if you buy a century bond, now you have a vested financial interest in the future of the United States. Because if you're going to have century bonds, you need to know that the United States government is on solid footing 100 years from now. And so you have a vested interest in making sure that we are successful and that we have the money that we need to when we're spending money. And so the idea is you lengthen the maturity. It makes it easier to pay this off over time. But then also at the same time, what this does is it gets buy-in from these countries that are under our defense umbrella. The other thing about this is, now I don't know if this is the original plan or not. This is what the Treasury Secretary said was the original plan, and after Donald Trump made his announcement today. The Treasury Secretary essentially said that the plan was always to levy an across-the-board 10% tariff on everybody, but have a different tariff level for China. That was always where they wanted to get to as an endpoint. Okay, was 10% across-the-board tariff, except China. China will be determined by the administration. Now, what the Treasury Secretary has come out and said is that their plan, the reason that they had this sort of that last week we had Liberation Day, right, with all the lists of all the tariffs that we were imposing on every country and like reciprocal tariffs. Some people got 10% and some people got like reciprocal tariffs like that, to account for the fact that, they have unfair trade practices and so there should be higher and these kinds of things. What the Treasury Secretary is now saying is that the plan all along was to create that environment to see what China's response would be. Because they wanted very high tariffs on China, but they didn't want to just come out and say, oh, we're going to have a 10% tariff on China or a 10% tariff on everybody else, and we're going to have like a 50% tariff on China. Okay. So what they wanted to do is they basically, according to the Treasury Secretary, what they wanted to do is they wanted to goad China into making it acceptable for them to do this. So they claim that their original plan was 10% across the board tariffs. Well, last week they had some countries got 10%, some countries got much higher than 10%.
Yep.
And so according to the Treasury Secretary, the plan is that you do this. China will feel like it's in a position of power because they will look at all the countries that were tariffing at these high rates and they'll think, oh, well, we can go up against the United States because even if that costs us to go up against the United States, we can align ourselves with these other countries because they're going to be just as mad at the United States as us. And so they'll come to us, right? And so we're in a position of strength. And so what we can do is we can actually retaliate against the United States and we can raise our tariffs on the U.S. And that's exactly what they did. And then the Trump administration would raise tariffs on, would say, oh, you're going to put tariffs on us? Well, guess what? Like the tariffs just got higher, right? And so now today the announcement is that after China retaliated again, Trump came out and said, fine, 125% tariff on China, but everybody else hasn't retaliated and everybody else is trying to negotiate. So we're actually just going to like lower everybody else's tariffs down to 10%. Okay.
That's the 90 days thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the idea here is that according to the Treasury Secretary, this was the plan all along. They needed to goad China into making this like, a tit for tat strategy so that they could justify having very, very high tariffs on China. Well, they got that. Okay. But now they have these 10% tariffs on everybody else. And he's basically said, well, they're going to stay at 10% for the next 90 days, but we're going to be negotiating our own trade deals with these countries, over the next 90 days. And so, we'll see how that goes, right? If they negotiate with us, then we'll see what we can get. If they don't negotiate with us, they got the 10% tariff.
Couple things real quick.
Yep.
In the thread, Andrew Seago Wealth Management kind enough to give a super chat. Andrew, thank you. He says, if you had a retirement income plan in place, the last few days were a lot less stressful. Go to rebelsretire.com to schedule a free first consultation. You can go to his office in Collierville. You can hook up on Zoom. Andrew's a great guy. Take great care of you. Andrew Sego Wealth Management. If you're in the Zoom, if you're in the YouTube, I should say, the link, I've put it in there. All right, Joey, who I don't think is a fan of the tariffs. He says the way it was rolled out was atrocious, and tariffs are not going to solve the deficit with Madagascar. Then he goes on to say the plan, in quotes, got changed depending on which official was speaking. They're just going with the plan that looks reasonable now.
So the question, the question here that nobody knows the answer to, although everybody that you listen to thinks that they have the answer. So, I mean, I was very careful here. What I said is that the Treasury Secretary said that this was the plan, that like they rolled it out the way that they did because they wanted to get China to kind of come back at them so that they could justify having such a high tariff. Now, do we know that that was the actual plan, or is that like an ex post justification for going to this thing? I don't know. And we can never know. The other thing is that the volatility here is by design. Like you have to have this. If you're going to use tariffs as a negotiating strategy, here's the fundamental problem with trying to guess what they're really doing. The whole point of that strategy is for you to be guessing what they are doing. So, for example, if I come out, if I'm the president and I come out and I say we're going to levy tariffs and we're just levying these tariffs because we want to use them as a negotiating tactic, well, it's not going to be a successful negotiating tactic because people know that you're not actually committed to the negotiation, right? So people are going to, so in other words, if I come out and I just say, hey, we're putting these tariffs on, but don't worry, everybody, like we're just doing this as a negotiation tactic. Well,
that won't work.
No, the other countries are going to go, well, why should we negotiate? Like you don't even want these things.
Well, that's the equivalent of telling your child, if you do this again, you're grounded. And then they keep doing it and you keep going, I'm telling you, the day's coming, you're going to get grounded. No, the only way that you're going to teach that lesson, I realize this is not apples to apples, but it's to say, all right, you're grounded for 2 days or a week or whatever the case may be, and then you enforce it and you send that message, right?
Well, and so the thing is that the only way, so here's the fundamental problem, okay? One hypothesis is that the administration is somewhat chaotic and disjointed, that you have people who disagree on why they're doing what they're doing. And so if you believe that line of thinking, that like, oh, like they're just disjointed, they all think that they're doing this for different reasons, then the mixed messaging is just part of the dysfunction of the administration. But if you're using these as a negotiation tool, you're going to end up in like an observationally equivalent world. Because if you're using this as a negotiation tool, you need some people who are out there sort of winking at the markets. Like, this is all just a negotiation and like winking. But then you have other people who are like, no, this isn't just a negotiation. Like we're for real. This is going to last. We're doing this, and we're not going to stop. And actually, like we're not going to negotiate at all. We're just we think this is in our best interest. That's the strategy that you follow if the administration is completely dysfunctional. But it's also the strategy that you follow if they're trying to use them as a negotiation tactic. So either way, it's observationally equivalent. We can never know, and that's the point. Is that we can never know, like, are they just dysfunctional is this part of the plan? And I think that when you look at how, when you look at how they rolled things out, like we can't really tell. Now, ex post, they're saying, well, this was the plan. Well, we don't know if it was really the plan, but the thing is okay, the reason that I am much more willing to suggest that this is actually the plan, that they're doing this as a negotiation tool, is that if you listen to the current Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, if you listen to him, like before he got into office and since he's got into office, he's been very, very clear that like this is a negotiation tactic, right? The chair of the Council of Economic Advisors is a guy named Steve Moran. Steve Moran wrote a paper back in November of 2024 outlining what the likely Trump strategy would be on tariffs and like how they would use tariffs and what they would be used for. And if you actually go read that paper, what Moran suggests is that maybe you would have something like a 10% tariff. What he suggests is that, and then what he suggests is that you might actually use these tariffs to then get countries to negotiate things like, so countries that manipulate their currency, you get them to actually just appreciate their currency relative to the dollar, so they're not artificially devaluing their currency to keep the dollars flowing into their country. So like Besant and Moran were talking about this stuff before they even had the job, that this is what the strategy should be. So I'm inclined to think that that is what the strategy is, but you can't come out and say, we're just doing this to negotiate, because if you say, well, we're just doing this to negotiate, then no one's going to negotiate. They're going to wait you out. They're going to say, fine, we'll just sit here and wait. Like, because if you don't really actually believe that this policy is good for you, well, then you'll either get rid of it or the next guy will. So we just have to wait you out.
So is so much of the hand-wringing, in your opinion, is it because, when I refer to this, I'm not referring to politicians, but economists. Is it they don't believe this will work? They believe this is dangerous? Or is this more of our very divided political discourse where if Team A says the sky is blue, Team B says no, it's black, and vice versa? I mean, that's kind of, there's been a lot of that in our discourse over the last, long time, and especially with Trump. Which is it? Well,
there's an ideology about free trade that sort of gets in the way of analysis of free trade, right? So like if you just take like the standard textbook model of trade, like, yes, like trade makes both countries better off, but it makes both countries better off in the aggregate. So what that means is like, if the US, doesn't trade with anybody and then they start trading with Canada, that will not only make the United States better off, but it will make Canada better off. Okay. The reason for that is that if we all just do like this is true at an individual level, and it's true at a country level. If we all just do like what we're best at, even if we suck at it, if it's what we're the best at, by me doing that thing, you don't have to do that thing. So it's saving you time to do something that you're better at. Okay. Right. And so then we trade with each other, and then there's more to go around because we're all doing the thing that we're best at. Right.
Okay. Yep.
That's the very basic principle that tells us that, trade is good. Okay. The issue is that there's this other detail that's lurking in the background of all these trade models. And the thing that's lurking in the background of all these trade models is that what you get is, when you start trading with other countries, you get what's called factor price equalization. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, like one factor price would be like wages. Okay, so one factor of production is labor. So one thing is wages. So if you get factor price equalization, if you get wage equalization, well, what does that mean? That means that wages in the countries that are trading start to converge. Well, if you're in the low wage country, that's great for you, right? Because your wages are rising.
Right.
If you are, if you're in the country with the high wages, okay, your wages are going to start moving down towards the other countries. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that convergence means that there are winners and losers from trade. So in principle, everybody's a winner in the sense that there's more stuff to go around, so everything kind of gets cheaper, and so so we can all afford more stuff. There's more stuff that's getting, and there's more stuff that's being produced. The problem is that there's a subset of people who are losers from trade because their compensation is going to fall. When this happens. And so the thing is that in economics, there's two definitions of sort of like efficiency. So one definition of efficiency is just if we add up all the benefits that are going to people who benefit and we subtract off all the losses that are going to people who have losses, do the benefits exceed those losses? So if you have positive net benefits, then that means like this is good for society. Okay.
Okay.
But there's another idea of efficiency which says that like the only way that you can make society better off is if you can make some people better off without making other people worse off.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
So those are two very different things, right? Because the first criteria just means the net benefits are positive. So some people win, some people lose, but on net, were better off. Okay. In the other scenario, some people are better off, some people are no worse off, and so therefore society is better off. Now, you can actually get these, so these two things can actually be equivalent, and they can actually be equivalent if what you do is, if the winners compensate the losers, then you can actually make some people better off without making some people worse off, right? Because the winners compensate the losers. So in other words, if there's a net benefit to society, the people who benefit the most should be willing to take some of their benefit and give it to the people who have suffered a cost.
Okay.
So that those people aren't any worse off. Okay. If you think about trade, we don't do this. Okay. The people who suffer from trade, those people are never compensated for that, right? So the factory moves overseas. Like, we don't give you like a bunch of money and say, hey, goods are cheaper now, so we're going to give you like a massive payment to compensate you for your lost income.
No, it's just pain.
No, we don't do that.
Yes.
And so the thing is...
Back to the thing in Michigan, right? The people in Michigan lose their jobs, but they don't get a benefit. Well, hey, the stuff that you need to buy is going to be cheaper now.
Well, see, that's the fundamental issue, is that that's actually what people say to them is, you lost your job, but like, look how much cheaper the stuff is at Walmart.
Yeah, but they'd rather have the job.
Right. And so first of all, like this, one issue is that this narrows things down to just like pure economic costs and benefits, right? Just pure, consumption versus income and all these kinds of things. Like, it's all just economic stuff. But there are also, but we value these things for other reasons. Like, we talked about this on previous podcasts. It's like, there's also like the dignity of work, like getting up and going and doing a job that you believe is important.
1 gazillion%
has value. And so if you lose that, even if everything is cheaper, and even if your income didn't go down, you would still be worse off because you don't have the same dignity of work every day. Okay, so that's another thing that people don't pay attention to. But the point here is that it's just a really like, I don't understand why people get I just don't understand why people don't see what I see, because it seems obvious to me. If there's winners and losers, of course the losers are going to want something right out of this deal. Like, we are losing from this deal. Their only recourse is the political process. That's their only recourse, is the political process. They are losing from a particular policy, and it doesn't matter to them that like society is better off. It doesn't matter to them that the total benefits exceed the costs. What matters to them is that they're worse off relative to what things used to be. And so their only recourse is then to go to, the political process and say, hey, fix this. And so that's a lot of what we're seeing now, is that people are coming to the political process and they're saying, hey, fix this. Hey, this destroyed my community. Fix it. And like, you can say, hey, those people shouldn't complain. You can have that opinion or whatever. But the point is like the idea that that this is not going to happen. I mean, the thing that frustrates me is that for a long time, people in my profession would point this out. They would say, yes, like free trade makes people better off, but there are people who benefit more. And there are also people who are losers in this situation.
Uh-huh.
And so maybe we should think about how to compensate the losers. So maybe if like the factory goes down, like maybe we have like a GI Bill or something, like the equivalent of a GI Bill for like the factory workers, where it closes down, where like, oh, the factory's closing down, but you know what? We're going to pay for you to go to, the local university. We're going to, and you can get a degree, or some form of compensation that helps those people do something else with their lives. Right. Like, but the thing is that what people have argued for a very long time is we don't have to do that. We don't have to do anything. Like, this is just, they can just go do something else. And like, maybe their wages will go down, maybe they won't, but like that's not for us to worry about, right? Like, that's been the attitude for a very long time.
Yeah.
And the problem is that you're seeing that like, not trying to figure out what to do when, not trying to figure out what to do, like has led to where we are now. Okay. Because we have all of these trends that are converging at the same time. We have all of these people, who are upset about our trade policies, who look at this and say, these trade policies made us worse off. And so it should be obvious that we're going to have some kind of fight like this over what should happen. And the thing is that like, this is another point in the direction of the status quo is not an option. Like just sticking with what we've been doing is not going to do it. And it brings me to a point that I've made before. And the point that I've made before is there's no Republicans and Democrats anymore. Not right now. There's not. What you have is you have people who have benefited from the system over the last 30 to 40 years and people who have suffered. Yep. That's what it is. The people who have benefited, they might call themselves Democrats, they might call themselves Republicans, but they're opposed to Donald Trump. And the people
because he's trying to change the status quo.
Right. And the people who have suffered, or the people who just recognize that there are people who have suffered, or that recognize that there are things that need to be fixed, those people are lining up behind Donald Trump. And that's why it looks like we're observing a political realignment. Now, I don't know if this is a permanent political realignment or if this is a Trump thing, but it certainly seems like it's a political realignment in the sense that there is now a sufficient coalition of people who think that the status quo is unsustainable and are like, we have to do something about this. And then there's a substantial group of people who look at the status quo and say, look, this is working out great. We just need to stay the course and just do this. Like, why,
Is it way too simplistic? When I've heard people say, well, if these tariffs are going to raise the prices of these things that we import from Europe or from China, China's the big one. Is it way too simplistic to say, well, is there an answer at home? And that is to produce those very goods here in America and made by Americans and sold to Americans where maybe you're not as dependent on China. And I realize that would raise production cost because you'd have to pay American wages, which would raise the price of the American good, but you would get Americans at work. Just talking, I realize this is incredibly vague, but is that too simplistic of an idea?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So the issue is
feel free to ridicule. I'm just curious.
No. The answer is yes and no because it's really complicated, actually. So number one, when we're thinking about these kinds of things, like the commenter is correct that like we're not going to solve trade deficits by just levying tariffs, but that's not that. But that's not like because that's not necessarily because like the tariffs won't like change relative prices, which then changes the pattern of production. That's not why. The reason is that as long as we continue to have the current international monetary system that we have, the United States is going to have to run trade deficits to supply dollars to the rest of the world. And the issue there is that you can try to run smaller trade deficits with the rest of the world, but that creates other kinds of frictions that are going to create other kinds of costs. And that's one of the reasons why I say like this is not sustainable. Like you cannot do this forever. Like you can't maintain this current system forever, and you can't maintain this current system forever because it requires you to run trade deficits forever, and it affects the pattern of trade that you do with the rest of the world for reasons that have nothing to do with comparative advantage or who's, it's not, this isn't, there's some aspect of trade that's not being driven by the fact that like, hey, they're just better at doing that than we are, so like, let's let them do it. That's the typical textbook reason for trade. But right now we have this additional reason for trade where you've got trade flows that are going, you've got trade flows that are based on the fact that, the dollar's value is tied to this thing that has nothing to do with trade, and it has everything to do with like how the international monetary system works. So, but the thing is that if you look at it, like COVID was actually like a canary in the coal mine for a lot of this stuff, which was what people discovered during COVID was just like how hard it was to produce certain things here in the United States. Like there are just certain things that it's become that it was just hard to produce in the United States. Now, part of that is for the regulatory reasons that we talked about. Part of that is because of this of the sort of patterns of trade that have taken place. But the thing is so it's trade policy alone can't solve this problem because we have these other trends that are also pushing us in the same direction. So, you know, if it was just trade policy, you could make the decision that, hey, having tariffs is could potentially bring jobs back, and that could solve the problem, and maybe we're willing to pay higher prices to have more American jobs or something like that. That's a choice that voters could make. The problem is it's not that simple because of these other trends that are going on. The other thing I want to say is that people who are in favor of these tariffs and people who are opposed to these tariffs, they're also saying conflicting things.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is like they're contradicting themselves, actually. So like they're having arguments with each other, but in the process, they're contradicting themselves. And this makes things really, really difficult because under certain circumstances, there are benefits to tariffs. And under certain circumstances, there are costs to tariffs. Okay. But like not all the benefits, but so like the benefits are contingent on, like the benefits and the costs are tied together, if that makes sense, right? So what I mean by this is like you'll hear people who support the tariffs who say U.S. consumers aren't going to pay the tariff and we're going to create lots and lots of jobs. Both things can't be true, okay? In order for the tariff to actually bring more jobs to the United States, the consumer actually has to be paying the tariff. Because if the consumer is paying the tariff, that means that the stuff abroad becomes more expensive. So they cut back on that stuff, but also the firms here at home produce a little bit more. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so if consumers are paying the tariff, then then you could get an increase in jobs. Okay. In the United States. On the other hand, you will have people who are opposed to the tariffs who will say consumers are going to pay the whole thing. They're going to pay the whole tariff, and it's not going to create any jobs, right? And so, no, if you have an optimal tariff where we don't pay anything, it's not going to affect our imports at all. It's just going to bring in revenue from foreign producers. Okay, now, in a certain sense, that's desirable, right? Because we get all this revenue and nobody here in the United States is paying for it. Okay.
Yep.
But it also doesn't create any jobs because the price that we pay hasn't changed. So consumers don't change their behavior. So we're still buying all the same stuff we're buying. It's just that now these foreigners are sending tax revenue to us, right? So you can't say, well, if that these are optimal tariffs that foreigners are going to pay and it's going to create jobs. You can't say that. But at the same time, you can't say consumers are going to pay the whole thing, but also it's not going to create jobs. Because if consumers are paying the full cost, then those foreign goods become more expensive, which means we buy more here, which creates jobs at home. And so that's also complicating the conversation because what they're doing is they're taking different scenarios and they're just like the people who are supportive of the tariffs, they're just talking about all the possible benefits of the tariffs, right? But they're not realizing that you can only have one or the other. You can't have both, right? But then you have the people who are opposed to it, and they're only talking about the costs. But you can only have one or the other. You can't have both.
Right.
Right? And so the thing is that the people who support them are overstating like the benefits of the tariffs, and the people who are opposed to them are overstating the costs, which makes this debate like really, really frustrating to follow because you have people who are saying contradictory things on both sides and which then makes it easier to argue with the other side, right? So whatever side you're on, you can argue with the other side because they're both making contradictory statements. And so you can say, oh, well, look, you're making a contradictory statement. And the other says, no, you're making a contradictory statement. And so it devolves into this nonsensical, conversation.
I don't even know where to go. So, all right, let me ask this. Wall Street Journal. We're starting to wind down. Today, this is a story written by Ling Wei. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. In the years since President Trump's first trade war with China, Beijing has built an arsenal of tools to hit the U.S. where it hurts. Now it is getting ready to deploy them in full. China is increasing tariffs on all U.S. imports to 84%, a response to U.S. tariffs. News that U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports of 100% 4% that went into effect at midnight Wednesday. It also added 6 U.S. companies, including defense and aerospace-related firms, Shield AI and Sierra Nevada, to a trade blacklist and imposed export controls on a dozen American companies, including manufacturer American Photonics and Brink Drones. The board's set of countermeasures appeared to have further provoked Trump. Sorry, the broad set. I'm having a hard time reading today. Provoked Trump, who on Wednesday moved to pause higher tariffs on dozens of other countries, but singled out China for an even bigger tariff hit. While Trump was focused on tariffs as his trade weapon of choice, China's strategy goes well beyond imposing its own levies, relying on the lure of the Chinese market for U.S. companies. A central thread running through its calculus is how to inflict hardship on those companies that bank on their ties with the world's second largest economy. Tools that Beijing has already used and is likely to expand include export controls of critical materials Americans used to make chips and defense-related products, regulatory investigations designed to intimidate and penalize U.S. companies, and blacklist intended to bar U.S. businesses from selling to China. In addition, authorities are preparing new ways to pressure American companies to give up their crown jewels, intellectual property, or lose access to the Chinese market. So it's not like the Chinese economy is a grand parade these days. How long does it take this? If this is a game of chicken, how long does it take before somebody steers off the road?
Well, I mean, the other thing is about these tariffs with China is that this gets to the second trend that I was talking about how like there's these geopolitical trends and there's these geopolitical realignments that are happening. And so one of the things I think people have to realize is that tariffs are predominantly like a political tool. Like we talk about them in terms of the economics, which is important. We need to understand what the economic costs and benefits of these things are. Okay. But I don't think that it's primarily a tool of economic policy. I think it's primarily a tool of foreign policy. And you hear people talk about this all the time where they'll say like, well, you know, the president shouldn't be in charge of tariffs. Congress should be in charge of tariffs. Well, did you ever stop and think about why Congress just sort of lets the president like, set tariffs? The idea that it's a political process would explain why the president gets to do it, because the president's commander in chief, the president controls foreign policy, the president's determining our stance, with countries around the world. Mm-hmm. And so if tariffs are a political tool, then you would expect that the president would be the one who would control the tariffs, right? Yeah. If they're a tool of economic policy, then yeah, like why isn't Congress acting? Well, the longer that the president has this authority, the more it looks like Congress is giving that authority. And, one reason they would give that authority is because these are political. When it comes to China versus the United States, I mean, I think the thing is that, the United States has to be careful here that it doesn't like shoot itself in the foot. But there's very, very clear problems with doing business in China. And part of the issue with doing business in China is that China for years has had these policies of essentially just like stealing intellectual property of foreigners who come over there, right? So foreigners have some product, they need to produce it cheaply, they go over to China, they make a deal with China to produce it over there. And then pretty soon, all of a sudden, there's like 100 competitors who are producing the same thing that you're producing, even though that they didn't have any when you showed up, right? Yep. Because they're taking the idea and then they're just doing it. And they're not honoring like intellectual property. There's no recourse in the courts. You can't go to the Chinese courts and say, hey, this guy stole my patent or something like that, right? Like there is no recourse. Okay, that's not fair. That's not how we do business. And first of all, let me just say, like in the United States, there was a time in the United States where we were actually like this. For about the first 25 to 30 years of the United States, we were kind of like this. Actually, like, I mean, I might be getting this wrong because this is coming off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure that it was under Andrew Jackson that we actually like reformed the patent office in the United States to like respect international patents. Okay. And so, Andrew Jackson was president in the 1830s. Okay, so we're about 40 years into the U.S. at that point. So, like, it kind of was a little bit of a Wild West with intellectual property and patent law and things like that in the United States. But the United States eventually got it together and like actually came up with, with
1836, President Andrew Jackson authorized the construction of a building to house the United States Patent Office, which opened in 1840, served as the Patent Office until 1932.
Yeah, and so like that was a huge change in the United States because it actually formalized this process of like patents in not only in the United States but also with reference to international patents. Because what was happening is the United States was doing something similar where there were people in Europe producing something and people and they had a patent to do that in Europe, but they didn't have a patent to do it in the United States. So somebody in the United States would take that idea and they would produce it. China has never China shows no signs of ever doing that. They are, and by all accounts, like they're actually worse than the United States was around that time, in part because they're just so much bigger than the United States was in the early 1800s. The one thing about China is that, that is significant is that China also has, these like rare earth minerals that, that other places in the Western world do not have. Okay. And so that's what I mean by like, well, you've got to be careful about this because you don't want to necessarily cut yourself off from access to these kinds of things. But at the same time, like this is being used as a political tool. China has been taking advantage not only of the United States, but lots of other countries for a very, very long period of time. There are geopolitical realignments taking place. And so, part of what the Trump administration seems to be doing too is trying to filter out like who's going to side with us in this sort of thing. Who's going to actually be on our side and who's going to, align themselves with China. And it's about clarifying where people stand on a lot of these issues because it's not actually clear because we're not in that we're not in that Cold War world anymore. We're in a new world. And so the question is like, are we moving into a world where it's kind of like the United States versus China, like it was the United States versus the Soviet Union, or are we moving into a world where it's still just kind of dominated by the United States? That still remains unclear, but like where people align is going to play a significant role in that. And so I think that the best way to look at this is like, look, there are significant risks to doing this, but there are also potentially significant benefits to doing this. But also you have to recognize that this is primarily political, and it's not necessarily about economics. It's about the fact that China is still a communist dictatorship. I mean, people forget about this. Yes, they have markets. Yes, they let people produce things. Yes, like they, like they're not your father's communism, right? But they are still a dictatorship. They still do not have the rule of law. You still do not have recourse in their court system, and they take advantage of that every step that they can. And so at a certain point, you have to stand up and say, enough is enough. You either have to change or we're going to stop doing business with you.
All right, last two things. Go to the stream. Thanks to everybody for being in the stream. We could probably go on and on and on. It would be unfair to Josh. We'll get back together. I don't think this is going away in 2 weeks. Reed Peets says, what about Besant's explanation of the diminishing ice block, tariff income decreasing as jobs increase? Although they are contradictory, can the former not lead to the latter?
Well, I think like one of the things that one of the things that they're getting at is kind of that Besant's been arguing is that this actually, like, yes, tariffs create distortions, but if they're successful, they kind of eliminate those distortions on their own, right? So in other words, in the short run, yeah, you have these tariff distortions which can make foreign goods more expensive, but as the production gets moved back into the United States, well, then you're necessarily less reliant on those tariffs because instead of buying it from the country that, is subject to the tariffs, you're buying it from somebody who produces it in the United States. So what you're doing there is like in the short run, you're getting tax revenue, and then in the long run, you're getting more jobs. That's the argument that they make. Now, there's a question about whether or not that's true, which gets back to this point that we talked about before, which it also depends on who's paying the tariff, right? So the thing is like if his argument turns out to be correct, it's going to come at a cost to the U.S. consumer to get those jobs back. Now, over time, that that kind of erodes. But the thing is that would require the U.S. consumer to pay most of the cost. If your argument is that the U.S. consumer is not going to pay most of that cost, then in that case, you're going to continue to generate the same amount of tariff revenue because it's being paid for by the foreigner, and people in the United States are not going to adjust their behavior. So it kind of depends on whether you're levying what we call optimal tariffs or not.
And then finally, Joey gives his opinion on what I was saying about who would break first. He says China should break first unless countries start building more trade with China instead of with us, which is why I had such an issue with the initial rollout. Thought it was pushing all the chips in.
Well, and yeah, I mean, that's the thing is like this was one of the major concerns. And so now what Besant says, and again, we don't know whether this was really the strategy or not, but Besant essentially came out today and said that that was kind of the intention, is they wanted China to think from the rollout that like they were giving them the upper hand. They wanted them to think that like, oh, look at this, like they're punishing so many people that those people are going to come to our side. And so then we can stand up to the United States because we'll have all these people on our side. Now, Besant claims that that was like that was done on purpose, like to convince the Chinese that they were making a mistake, and so that they would retaliate and get really, really aggressive with the United States, which would allow the United States to get more aggressive with them, and then they could relax the tariffs on everybody else and accept China and say, well, see, everybody else wants to negotiate. You're accelerating the situation. Now, we don't know for sure whether that's really what the plan was. That's what they say it was now.
Right.
But yeah, that's the other thing is that, I mean, this is always the difficulty. And this is partly what I mean about like about trade being much more like these tariffs being much more of a political tool, is like a lot of this is about politics more than it is about economics. And on that note, like the thing that the United States potentially has going for it over China is that, but this is where the Trump administration has to be careful, because what the United States has over China is like, who are you going to trust? Are you going to trust the United States, or are you going to trust the communist dictators? Right. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the countries who have gone with these like Silk Road policies that are kind of created by the Chinese government have kind of realized the hard way that like the Chinese don't play fair, right? They come in and they make you a deal, and then it turns out that like they're getting a lot of the benefits of like they come in and they promise you, oh, we're going to help you build all this infrastructure, and then it turns out like the Chinese own it all when it's built, mm-hmm. and things like that. And so the thing is right now the advantage that the United States has is that more people can trust the United States than China. So aligning with China is difficult because it's like, how do I know that I can trust them? Right. But at the same time, though, the Trump administration has to be careful, because if the Trump administration is too aggressive with certain countries, they can lose that goodwill. And then they basically look at it and go, well, I can't trust China, but you know what? I don't think I can trust them either. So it's a coin flip, right? And so then maybe they go with China. So you do have to be careful about using these things as political tools, because if you push too hard, then you can force people to sort of shift their alignment.
By the way, Andrew agreed with something you said earlier. He said, always enjoy Josh's input. His point about refinancing U.S. debt is spot on. Almost 15 years of minus 2% 10-year treasuries fed a lot of spending, but if we refinance that debt at rates closer to historical norms, we could be in real trouble. So, yeah. Josh, I wish I were smarter where I could ask more intellectual questions, but I learned a lot. I'm sure a lot of people did too. Again, I don't think this is going away in the next couple of weeks. We'll talk about this and more next time we get together.
Sounds good.
That's Josh Hendrickson, Chair of Economics at Ole Miss. I'm Neal McCready. Until next time, take care.